paleoclimatology, but also got really interested in urban heat islands a little over 5 years ago, and have been working in that space ever since. And I've been really fortunate to help develop a community science model for measuring urban heat islands that's now been replicated in over 50 cities nationwide, and a few internationally as well. And what this model centers on is building a coalition of organizations that represent governments, nonprofits, education organizations, and other sectors to co-produce a plan for volunteers to go out and collect air temperatures during a local heat wave using vehicle and bike mounted thermometers. It's really fun, gets a lot of media attention. And these observations are then used to generate a map that shows the heat burden throughout the entire city. And that provides a really highly detailed description of the thermal quality of something like an individual city block, which we found to be very effective for place-based interventions. And the goal of this work is to foster new and strengthen previous collaborations around climate and other forms of justice organizations, which ultimately is improving climate resilience in the community through these civically legitimate and actionable data sets. We've uncovered some really interesting patterns that reflect housing policy decisions from almost a century in the past. And many cities are already joining up for campaigns next summer already. So I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks. Let's go next to Lisa.
So hi, everybody. I echo Jeremy's thanks for being included in this panel. I feel like I think I'm the practitioner on the panel. Not that academia is not a very important role in this. After working in several different organizations on sustainability and various levels of sort of climate change policy or action. I moved to Baltimore 4 years ago, sort of to move from higher ed specifically to work in local government, because I felt like the work that was happening there on equity and resilience was so important, and was not something I could do in my role on the operations side in higher education. As we can see, there's roles on the academic side. And so what drew me to the Baltimore office is that we're somewhat unique in working on both, kind of regular environmental sustainability issues, but climate and disaster preparedness. So we write the plans for climate action, but also the federal hazard mitigation plans that are required. And so, that means that along with the permitting work, the other environmental permitting work and the floodplain management work that my office does, so flooding and heat are high on our agenda. As a bit of an aside, we're part of the planning department too. So it's really nice that we have those connections to sort of the land use and the capital planning efforts as we sort of craft our portfolio. But, when, flooding and heat, especially are areas where our residents are really already seeing the impact from the changing climate. And heat is one that we know from some of the maps that have been, created by us and others on the panel, that it really affects our historically disinvested neighborhoods the most. And so, part of the reason I'm here is that given our planning department's past role in creating some of the inequities in the system, the burden is really on us to work with our communities and addressing them. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Robert.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for including me in this. I'm not an environmental scientist. I'm an historian, and what has drawn me into a lot of conversations around environmental inequities, whether that be heat, flooding, health. I'm having more and more of these conversations that I did not anticipate having as a 19th century Americanist. And it is this work that colleagues and I have done on redlining and making a data set available looking that documents and particularly has spatial data related to redlining in the 1930s. And Jeremy mentioned that his heat work that they've did that work, and then they noticed that this had kind of a striking visual similarity and statistical similarity to the redlining data from the 1930s. And so what's been great about our data set, and what's been really wonderful about some of the work that Jeremy and others have done using this data set, is it's not trying to draw some kind of causal link between housing policy and environmental burdens exactly. I mean, these are correlation. Well, no, let me back that up. So it is not as if redlining causes environmental inequities today. There's a correlation there. And what redlining data set is I think of it as like the kind of tip of the iceberg, right? That this is one view that we have of systemic racism in 20th century America, particularly in 20th century American real estate, because what is more systemic than federal policy and the financial institutions, the banks, and where money goes, right? So this gets to Lisa's point about governments bearing some responsibility, a great deal of responsibility for the environmental inequities we see in cities today. So the real kind of importance of this is not to kind of like get into some kind of wonky question about historical causation, but just to recognize that the environmental inequities, the environmental injustices that we see in cities today have some roots in past policies, past governmental policies. And that being the case, there's we know that, as Lisa mentioned, that governments have some responsibilities for redress and repair in these areas. And B, we recognize the importance and the effect of policy just generally, right? Like if policy makes and helps to create these environmental inequities, and they're not just kind of accidents of the market or the like, policies can help undo them, right? And I think it also adds the one final thing I'll say about this is we're talking about policies that were made 8 decades ago that were implemented over at least a half century, probably better, more closer to a century. And so we're fooling ourselves when we think that there's kind of any simple policy solutions to this. So we have to be in this for the long haul, right? We have decades of policies that caused inequalities. We've got decades ahead of us of sustained work to undo those through anti-racist and environmental justice policy.
Thanks, Robert. Scott, finishing it off with you.
My apologies, I was muted. Thank you for the invitation. Pleased to be here. I'm probably on the opposite end of the spectrum from Lisa. I'm an urban climate scientist working within academia. And yeah, I think I've always been interested in environmental issues and justice issues broadly. And really how I got into working on climate is I was an undergraduate in the atmospheric science program at UBC in Vancouver, Canada. And I was working in research one summer for a professor, and he posed me the following question. He said, if every second building in Toronto had a green roof, how much cooler would it be in the city on a typical summer day? And so that question really intrigued me. And it turned out at the time, we didn't have the tools embedded in our climate models. So we weren't able to represent cities very well. And we certainly weren't able to represent green roofs very well in our climate models. And so really that's what I've been doing ever since, is developing these models. I did my PhD at UBC looking at how can we actually model and represent urban street trees in large climate models so we can model their effects on cooling urban neighborhoods. And finally, I ended up doing my postdoctoral work at Arizona State. And there I was part of a very large NSF-funded project with a substantive environmental justice component. So that's where I started to become aware of these issues in a little more depth. And I've since collaborated with some researchers looking at environmental equity in terms of heat in the Phoenix metro area. And maybe I'll have a chance to share a bit more about that later.
Excellent, thanks. Don't go anywhere, Scott, because this next question is actually for you.
Okay.
So the IPCC, an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which many people are familiar with, aware of at least, released its most recent report, I think a week or two ago. which very plainly kind of states that we are not on track to minimize global warming below the 1.5 Celsius mark. So your work, as you were saying, your work having to do with green roofs is not just talking about how extreme heat affects communities and urban communities, but how the urban communities themselves go back and is kind of this like feedback loop into impacting extreme heat. So can you speak a little bit on how urbanization is impacting our ability to, or inability to stay below this 1.5 Celsius increase?
Yeah, that's a very complex two-way interaction between, urban areas and, how do we adapt and change our urban areas such that we can mitigate climate change more effectively, but then also how do we adapt our urban areas to the developing climate crisis, really, because as climate change progresses, we get more extreme heat, as we all know, and then the divide between those who are more heat vulnerable and those who are not is exacerbated. Maybe what I'll do here is talk a little bit about the urban heat island as well. So this background heat, this background warming and heat waves and extreme heat are going to affect rural and urban areas roughly similarly, and they're going to affect all the areas in the city similarly. But then there's this added heat burden due to how the city is developed in different areas, and I think that's largely what this panel is about. But I just want to tease a couple of things apart here. First of all, there's different types of heat islands, and there's two main types of heat islands that we can talk about I think in the current context. One is the air temperature urban heat island. So it's the air temperature is warmer in the city compared to outside the city. And that primarily exists during the nighttime and evening hours. Then there's also the surface temperature urban heat island. So surfaces such as pavement and buildings and concrete are much hotter than vegetation and that you might find in more heavily vegetated suburban areas or rural areas. And that usually peaks more during the daytime. So we've got these two different ways we can look at the added heat burden due to how we've developed different parts of the city or how we've developed the city. And both of them affect how comfortable or how warm we feel outdoors, and both of them affect the heat burden placed on buildings. But what neither of them really clearly captures is the importance of shade in cooling down the outdoors. So that's a third piece that's really critical to speak about. And we all know it feels cooler when we're in the shade of trees or on the shady side of the street. So, right now, I think on the research side, we're working with ways how to address how can we actually capture the effects of air temperature and surface temperature and shade all in one in a combined sort of metric and map that over entire cities and how that varies over the course of the day. So we actually have a sense of, with all of these factors together, where are the hottest areas in the city? That's still, I think we're still working on that, but we're getting there. And the final thing I want to say is that so far I've basically talked about outdoor climate. And at least in the US, my understanding is, people spend by far the majority of their time indoors. So a lot of heat exposure actually occurs indoors. And so a huge part of the issue here is not only the outdoor climate and how much vegetation there is and questions like that, but also the quality of buildings, the building envelopes, the ventilation, air conditioning, and all of these factors. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Hopefully that's an answer to your question.
No, absolutely. That provides us some crucial framing for moving forward. Bringing in now the equity piece, the environmental justice piece, each year we're hearing about these record-setting temperatures in our cities, but hearing less so, or definitely not hearing the focus that this is disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous, people of color communities within those cities. And these are the communities that are suffering the most from these heat waves. So I'd like each of you to kind of speak to the importance of bringing these stories to the fore and highlighting the environmental justice narratives that are going on at the same time that we have climate change and the climate crisis, which is affecting everyone. I'd like you to kind of drill down on the equity piece of this and bringing those stories to the fore. So I'll start with you, Lisa.
Great, thanks. When Scott talked about a question that kind of was driving his sort of, his research, it reminds me that one of the questions I often ask myself in this work is, whose story is this to tell? Just kind of a shorter version of what you're asking, besides the obvious ones about who's around the table and who builds the table. And, I think it's worth, stopping and noting that, we have 4 white panelists as we're talking about environmental justice. And, I know that I'm the one on this panel today, but I would, I do, as often as I can, try to connect reporters or higher ranking agency staff, directly to community members when there are questions about that. Sessions that are during the day, which is not a criticism of this session at all, are then often harder for us to make those connections. The ones where there can be flexibility of those connections, or where we can do that more. And so I just needed to start with sort of that, a humility that I'm going to be maybe an imperfect messenger of some of the messages and of the importance of this. But I do think that, it is really important to design, to center those community voices as we set the priorities and design the solutions. And as if we do that, then it helps make those narratives be more easy to share. And it helps build trust that if we are indeed proposing the right solutions or working towards the right end, that we've built trust with government. So what are the kinds of things we can miss? We have a program with community resiliency hubs. And one of the things we've learned from those leaders is that they're constantly under stress. This isn't just an issue of when it's hot or when there's another climate-related emergency. And so they define resiliency differently than we had been doing it. So we are trying to craft that hub program so that it doesn't just activate during disaster, but that it strengthens sort of, social bonds and preparedness and support in advance and supports those day-to-day efforts. We also risk missing what else needs to change. What are other needs and solutions? I went back and read some of the articles that were published recently about heat in Baltimore. We talked to the community. And what I noticed is that, that also gave them a chance to be critical of government in a way that if it's filtered through me, doesn't come across in the same way. And, I think that's an important statement about what needs to be done, because, and helping make those decisions of what to do, because our community members can really be our most powerful change agents. They motivate their neighborhoods, and they can really give additional incentives to local government to make those changes. Other more specific, this is a topic I should be more comfortable talking about, but if you had a community member in addition or instead of me on this panel, you might be hearing conversations about reparations or other broader systemic changes that really could impact all of this. And I'll stop there, and maybe there are others who can talk more about that particular topic better than I can.
Sure, thanks. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session of this particular session, or part of this particular session, to get some of those flavors into the conversation. I'll hop over, I'll give you a break, Scott, and go to Jeremy.
Yeah, and I would say it's certainly not lost on me as well that I don't claim at all to know the best way forward with the data, and I've learned so much from my colleagues at the local nonprofits that we collaborate through the Science Museum of Virginia here in Richmond. I would like to just call a few of them out if you're interested in some of the participants looking these folks up. Groundwork RVA, which is a teen workforce development nonprofit. Happily Natural Day, which is a food justice nonprofit here in Richmond. Southside Relief, which is actually working specifically in a marginalized community to expand tree canopy and develop advocacy around climate justice in Richmond. And then Virginia Community Voice, which is working on a Southside Richmond greening plan, centering the voice and vision of the residents of Southside Richmond in what the future of green space development looks like. So I just wanted to celebrate those folks who I've learned so much about how to go about doing this taking climate action to a new level through centering these marginalized communities. And what's interesting is that something that we noticed about our heat studies, here in Richmond, Baltimore, DC, and then dozens of cities around the country, is that when you all of a sudden have a map that shows that there's like tens of degrees of air temperature difference at the hottest part of the afternoon, just a couple miles away from each other in the same city, that really like localizes this impact of climate on folks who might otherwise see climate change as really far away in time and place. And most of the time that tends to be white communities. On the flip side, in many ways, the findings of our studies are not at all a surprise to residents of marginalized communities and mostly communities of color. And almost always they have a clear vision for like what their neighborhood already needs and where, and it's just been ignored, either intentionally or structurally through the systems that continually oppress them. And so if we don't listen and center these residents in the conversations, we basically end up with the same processes and systems that gave rise to the harmful practices of things like redlining and urban renewal after that, and other forms of really targeted neighborhood disinvestment and marginalization. And so it's just interesting that I think we will miss the opportunities to address the actual lived experience of folks that live in these neighborhoods instead of just looking at their lived experience through data, which is a lot of the times what us as kind of climate practitioners tend to do. Their life is just as important as the data set that we use to analyze these issues. And I think then that also means that their ideas are just as important as our professional expertise. We should be weighing what the community says at the same level as kind of our ability to model the impacts of our interventions. And so in effect, we can basically be amplifying past harms by not centering these communities and really treating and listening to them in a way that's respectful and appreciative and ultimately would change the narrative of our local climate change action plans.
Thanks, Jeremy. Now, Robert, I want to move on now and talk a little bit more about the Mapping Inequality project, and specifically how when we're talking about climate, we're looking back not just the last year, the last 6 years, we're looking back decades and we're looking back centuries. The same can be said for systemic inequality, systemic racism. So how does the Mapping Inequality bring these two things together?
There's a few answers to that question. So one is that the Mapping Inequality data set is it's a project, it's a map, it's used by teachers and just interested citizens to look at their cities, and we love that too, right? So because nobody people are far more interested in the place they live, right? Like there's an investment in their homes, in the places that they inhabit, and so people being able to go in there and explore the data set, look at the maps. The response always is like it looks exactly how people were surprised by the resonances between the way they think of their cities today and what these maps look like 80 years ago, right? And maybe this is like shouldn't come as any surprise to us, but it still should be a shock about the entrenchment, the calcification of vulnerability and poverty in some areas, and privilege and wealth in other areas, and how that just does not change over the course of a century. And then one thing we want to do with this is not just kind of let people in Kalamazoo or Portland or Fresno or wherever they are look at their cities and use it for kind of reckon with history in their areas. And so like Jeremy mentioned groundwork designs, and they use our maps really effectively to and coming back to that question about like investing in and centering communities of color, right? Like their work is exemplary in as much as they're trying to tackle some of these climate inequity issues, but they're doing it by paying students in these areas and training students in these areas and giving them skills and experiences that are really kind of useful. And so the last thing you want to do is to address these without investing in those communities. I mean, these efforts to redress what's happening in hot neighborhoods of color have to benefit the people in those neighborhoods, and we have to put people first and not places or temperature, right? It has to be about people, right? Okay, so sorry, back to your question. So, so we gave away the data set because we want to be able people to look at systems, right? And we didn't know exactly what people would do with it. And I certainly wasn't anticipating that there'd be heat island research that would be coming out of this. But one of the amazing things about this project is giving away that data is alerted us to correlations between contemporary inequalities and past inequalities built into these housing policies that we weren't thinking of. That has made us even aware that these are not new, right? This is not like there's redlining and like everything was equal back in the 30s climate wise, and this created these inequities. These were built in from the get-go. And so when Jeremy and his colleagues released their study, we started kind of noticing more environmental language in the area descriptions. So Scott was mentioning shade. We threw the area descriptions into a text classifier, and one of the words that is tightly associated with B graded neighborhoods, blue neighborhoods, higher graded neighborhoods, is shade. Trees is another one. And on the other hand, if you look at D neighborhoods, you get paved and you get word like hot, right? So these environmental inequities are not new, right? These are not a product of like post-war climate change. They were there in the 1930s, and one of the things that was baked in and considered as they were making these divestment, investment decisions that are baked into the redlining grades. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Thanks. And so I know, Jeremy, I know you touched on a little bit on your work with in the last question, but I wanted to know if you could drill down a little bit further as we're talking about, the people at the roots of the work, and especially since you mentioned not looking at it through the lens of data, not looking through it strictly through the lens of data. Going off of Robert's Mapping Inequality project overview there, can we go into the Throwing Shade project and then the relationships kind of through that project?
Yeah, sure. So the Throwing Shade in RVA project, which is really pleased that it's still ongoing today, because the work never ends, is that it has its roots in a conversation I had with my colleague Duran Chavis over lunch when we had gotten our heat island map data back, and he took one look at it and he just he said really plainly, the block is hot. And our conversation really quickly turned to how many other maps, including the ones that he was using for his food justice nonprofit, Happily Natural Day, like vacant properties, food deserts, all those things looked exactly like the redlining map, or the heat map. And also this redlining map tended to look the same way. And so that gave me the idea to look at some of the other cities that we'd done these community science engagements in, Baltimore, Boston, Portland, and they all showed the same pattern as well, and hotter temperatures in the formerly redlined areas. And this turned into an exploration of all of the cities in the HOLC database. And while we hadn't measured air temperatures in all of these cities, as Professor Krayenhoff said, is that we have other ways of kind of proxying for this urban heat island effect. And so we used surface temperatures collected from satellites, and basically looking at the average temperatures in these redlined areas and their other non-redlined counterparts, we were able to show that in 94% of these cities, these formerly redlined areas in the present day have higher surface temperatures than their non-redlined counterparts. And this is directly related to the land use in these cities. The redlined areas have many fewer trees, much more paved over surfaces. And what's been really building our confidence in the observations and our conclusions is that since that study was published in January 2020, a bunch of other ones have replicated these findings in a few different ways and adding additional stressors like flooding and air quality, and showing that basically across the board, all of these environmental stressors are proportionally worse and poorer quality in formerly redlined areas than in non-redlined areas. And so this Throwing Shade in RVA project basically deepened our involvement with groundwork RVA, basically giving the students that they work with and engage in their green team, basically showing them the map and saying, what would you do with this? And it was amazing, you know, leading them through some hands-on experiences with the thermal, like an IR thermometer. We had a small budget to basically say, like, what would you do if you could prioritize a place and prioritize an intervention? And the students took it all the way to planting fruit trees in their schoolyard, not only as a shading, eventually, you know, 20 or 30 years from now, they're going to be quite nice shade trees, but also to provide fresh food. So again, it's that idea that the residents and especially the children in these areas understand these multifaceted and complex systems that work to create these environmental disamenities in their neighborhoods. And so it's been really great to see. Not only has Throwing Shade in RVA been really successful locally, but it's been applied in other cities, including now through the Groundwork USA network, which is using it in some ways, that model of redlining, heat, and other environmental stressors as a way to get teens in on climate action in their cities.
That's really awesome. That's excellent. So jumping from that now and going to talk about solutions. So planting the fruit trees is one example of the solution. What are some preventative or, you know, some forward-looking solutions, but also, Lisa, you mentioned reparations, which I won't force you to talk on, but when we're thinking about solutions, we have to be aware of the context, that the current context, but also the context in the future. So now when we're thinking about this from the standpoint of decision makers, your legislators, your planners, developers, built environment professionals, what are some steps that they can take, some policies, some best practices, some actions that can be taken to reduce the threat posed by this urban heat island reality in communities of color? So I'll start with you, Lisa.
Great, and you wouldn't have to force me to talk about reparations. I'm just not sure I could, you know, bring the best presentation of those arguments without, you know, talking to more people. But, you know, what I can start with is sharing a couple of the solutions that we've been doing in Baltimore and kind of why we think those, you know, to the extent to which we think those are more universal. And so one is kind of an umbrella of response, which are the community resiliency hubs that I've mentioned. And I think people have heard of this concept. In Baltimore, we currently have 12 of them right now. And these are community organizations. None of these are city buildings. These are you know, groups that are located in neighborhoods that are vulnerable to these inequitable impacts to climate change. And, you know, we're looking to improve that kind of hyper local community capacity to respond to the natural hazards. And so our hubs have sort of helped with cooling during heat waves. They've handed out water, helped us distribute box fans that we got in. But they've also helped provide sandbags in flood prone areas when there was a flood watch going on, you know, charging stations during power outages, which again is, I think, a more common view of, you know, when people think of resiliency hubs, that they have that solar and battery backup or some sort of power backup. You know, we've even had them serve as, you know, post-disaster recovery staging areas. And of course, they were all of them stepped up and, you know, multiplied their efforts during the pandemic and distributed food, hosted testing and vaccination clinics. You know, just as a quick aside, you know, back to what we hear when we listen. You know, our health department reached out to the hubs and said, "Hey, can we come and do testing next week?" And our hub leader said, "You know, you've got to come back on a regular basis. You can't just come once." You know, besides the fact that not everybody's going to be able to, again, make it in that, whatever that time window is, because, you know, people have a lot going on, but you need to keep coming back to sort of show that you're, you know, that, you know, people's voices and time matters to the city. But, you know, I think, you know, one way to make solutions more equitable is to make equity explicit as you're planning those. And I know that sounds kind of obvious or even glib. But it's about not just saying it, but doing it and then reporting and tracking it. So I mentioned that our planning department does the capital planning for the city. So for several years now, we've reported where money gets spent in the capital budget to the best that we know. And we are pushing agencies to make sure that they give us that information on where it's spent, because obviously there's emergency road repairs that the Department of Transportation doesn't know where they're going to be ahead of time, or they wouldn't be emergency road repairs. But having that kind of explicit focus and definition and accountability to government, I think is important to this. What I think we've seen in heat is, the staff who are working on this need more resources and the freedom to plan bigger. You're seeing cities creating chief heat officers, and what they're signaling is this is important to us, and their mandate, to the extent that it is focused on the more vulnerable BIPOC neighborhoods, also sends that signal. What we also are looking to do is to try to be creative and sort of try new things, even if we can't do them all the time. So some of the ideas, again, that we've had from some hub leaders, one of them, they had water that they were giving out on extreme heat days, but they went and put a cooler with ice in the water next to the bus stop in front of their organization, because people are waiting in bus stops that don't often have shade, speaking of places that need shade. And then also noticing that a lot of them are in areas where there are other social services, where for social distancing, people are having to line up outside in the heat for long periods of time. And again, trying to get water, we haven't succeeded as much in shade in this time frame. Really, sort of, I think expanding our efforts, and we even had a hub leader, talk about how, the cooling center, we've got the cooling centers supplied by the city, but then there are the other ones, and where, malls and pools might not have been open during the pandemic. In general, if you have more retail, you're going to have more sort of, cooling areas, cool areas that are closer to people that can help get that done. And so, that's kind of the approach we're trying to take, is to really think big on resiliency hubs that are having a much broader sort of heat mitigation and management plan, but also really diving into some of those detailed ideas that can really help build up to that bigger plan and see better results.
Thanks, Lisa. Scott, how about coming over to you on the same question, kind of looking back and looking ahead? What are some tangible, applications?
Sure, yeah, I can speak to this a bit more from the scientific perspective, and I fully agree with Lisa that working with local communities is critical, and often science can be a little top down, and I think that needs to be recognized as we move forward more and more. So I think first I'll just say continuing to mitigate global climate change is critical. I think that's sort of a big elephant in the room if we ignore that. Secondly, I think I want to say that heat can really be mitigated at different scales. So Lisa was mentioning bus stops, right? So at hyper local scales, you can provide shade, trees, things like that. And then you can also think at larger scales. Like if you want to lower the air temperature in a whole neighborhood, then that might, then you're looking at the overall vegetation cover and providing shade at a larger scale. So there's different scales we can think at. And I think another thing I think Lisa alluded to is really targeting these interventions. And we recently did some work targeting interventions in heat vulnerable areas in Phoenix. And because it's a water limited, or certainly will be in the future, water limited area, we looked at cool materials, so highly reflective materials. And we located the most heat sensitive or heat vulnerable areas based on various demographic information. And then we, using in our climate model, so this was a climate model exercise rather than actual implementation, we implemented cool roofs in the most heat vulnerable areas. And we found that it was actually a very effective way to cool a lot of people, a lot of heat vulnerable people in our simulation. And and targeting those who need it most. The interesting thing, though, is even with a fairly drastic implementation like that, we found that thermal equity or environmental equity in terms of heat was not achieved. So the wealthier, more vegetated areas at the edge of town were still cooler even after this intervention. But yeah, I think more generally, I think mitigating heat using cool materials, using trees and vegetation, et cetera, are really important. I liked what Jeremy said about addressing heat and flooding and air quality with the same intervention. And vegetation is really good because it mitigates flooding as well as addresses heat. And if it's implemented right, so there's some nuances in here, it can also address air quality to a certain extent because trees can worsen air quality. So there's, it's got to be done right because you really want airflow for air quality, but also in a hot, humid climate, you also want airflow for heat. That's so really thinking about how you plant trees and where you plant trees is critical. You want to provide shade, but also not block the airflow too much. I think those are a few things, but I certainly think mitigating heat in terms of infrastructure, like green infrastructure, can be very useful. Climate change, and then also providing adaptation options. So, improving the built infrastructure, providing cooling centers, things like that, such that indoor environments are available that are cooler.
Thanks. Jeremy.
Yeah, I would just say one of the interesting things that I've seen recently was evaluating the different types of shade and the ways that we can intervene. And like one of the, and I mean, as a climate change, general idea is that our cities are going to continue to grow, whether we want them to or not. And the census data actually shows this to be the case, with the largest American cities getting larger and some of the smaller ones achieving their first time over 100,000 people in them. And really, one of the interesting combinations of this is like, one of the best and most efficient cooling agents as far as shade goes is structural. There is this green, I'm a huge green proponent, but what's interesting is that we can actually, and starting to see these things all as intertwined, is that by providing a denser, more walkable, more human-centered kind of design of a city, we can actually increase the green amenities while also generating shade at the right times of day that to produce the most meaningful outcomes for people that might be at an unshaded bus stop. So one thing that I think is really interesting about these things is that we can, if we understand the geometry of a city, we understand the geometry of the sun, that pretty much never changes. So we can always use those sorts of understandings of the natural world and the physics of the natural world around us to really come to kind of one of those. It's never going to be a silver bullet. It's going to be some sort of silver buckshot solution to these things all happening at once. I would also say that based on like that idea of producing and making available cooling spaces, we recently made our bus system fare free. One of the best ways to cool people down is to give them some sort of free publicly available space to cool down. And so, even though it wasn't touted as a cooling solution, by making buses free and hopefully by increasing their coverage and frequency, you could have a mobile cooling unit traveling around that most people from these marginalized communities depend on to begin with. So there's also these kind of like, there are so many solutions that we might not think about as being heat solutions that truly are at the same time.
That's excellent. That's really innovative, and I think it definitely should be touted at. I mean, climate is all around us. Climate change, the climate crisis is all around us. So all of our solutions should be climate oriented and touted so that they can get those climate dollars as being climate solutions. Robert, do you have anything to add here?
I'll take a slightly different tack because I'm no expert on the environment. I would just say from a housing policy perspective, this could play some role, maybe not in lowering the temperature, but at least in making a little bit more equitable the way we racially are experiencing this, right? So I'm thinking of things like cities that are eliminating single-family zoning, right? And are just kind of working to have some zoning policies and other policies like federal government. You think of like Section 8, making that more available, and so that, you know, we have a long history in this country of people of color being consigned to the worst places in cities environmentally. Like I'm thinking like you think of the word like the bottoms, right? This has a kind of association with communities of color, and but it has environmental association too. These are the areas that were prone to flooding, and where African Americans in the late 19th, early 20th century were often consigned in Jim Crow America. And so eliminating, again, like single family zoning, and just anything that can mitigate the forces that maintain the segregation we still see in American cities, at least doesn't lower the temperature, but at least distributes the burden of this a little bit more equitably. And then I would say, you know, at the federal level, the Biden administration has their Justice 40 initiative around environmental justice, which is to invest 40% of monies that are going to environmental and green efforts are supposed to be invested in communities of color. You know, I don't know where they came up with that 40. I'd like it to be Justice 75. That sounds a little better to me, but it is better than nothing. And that so at the city level and at the federal level, all levels of government, we need policymakers to be really mindful of this, and to still always take into consideration issues of racial equity as they're thinking about housing and climate together.
Thanks, Robert. I like the sound of Justice 75 also. As a quick kind of aside, we do have a Justice 40 related session. I think it's later, it's tomorrow. So make sure you check that out for more details there. This is going to be our last question from me, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions. But Scott, you brought up the building envelope and air conditioning. And I want to take some time here and talk about energy. So this isn't something we've substantively talked about yet, but when we're talking about the cost of energy, the lack of AC, the lack of access to air conditioning is often an energy related issue. That's a systemic burden that is placed on communities of color and BIPOC communities. So from a zooming out maybe a little bit, when we're talking about these systemic issues, what are the solutions to ensure that, and I also saw kind of a relevant question to this in the Q&A, but as we're talking about these incremental fixes and you know, these green fixes and retrofits and infrastructure change and stuff like that, how do we fix kind of these root causes as it relates to what's actually keeping communities of color hot, which is, you know, their inability to have air conditioning when they need it in their homes, and kind of some of the more structural things there. So I'll go back to you, Scott, for that.
Okay, great. Yeah. This is probably a little bit outside of my domain of expertise, but I'm aware of some of the literature, so that I'll give you a couple things that can hopefully get the discussion started. I think one thing is, my understanding is that there's fairly high use of AC by those who can readily afford it, and that drives up the cost for others and maybe makes it inaccessible for those who might need it the most in a lot of cities anyways. And you know, a lot of buildings end up being cooled more than they actually need to be because certain people can afford it. And so I don't know if there's, you know, a way to address that. That's not really my domain, but I think there's an opportunity there to expend less, like distribute the cooling energy more equitably. And I think one thing that's often overlooked is the use of fans. So if someone's cooling their house down to 68 and they actually only need to cool it down to, I don't know, you know, I'm trying to convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit, being a Canadian, down to 65 or something, and then use fans to get the exact same thermal experience, right? Which is a much more energy efficient solution. And then that lowers the cost of energy for others to cool themselves. So I think one point I would make is that I think fans are an underrated mechanism for indoor cooling and can actually help save energy. And maybe, I don't know if there's mechanisms to help spread that cooling energy around.
Thanks, Scott. I'll go over to you, Jeremy.
Well, I'm certainly not an energy expert, but what I love learning about immensely is like vernacular architecture. So here in the South, there were kind of passive cooling techniques that were integrated into housing all over the city, and throughout cultures that have dealt with extremely high temperatures. Folks in the Middle East, in India, where they've exceeded 105 degrees on the heat index, and wet bulb globe temperatures that are dangerous for like days on end. Part of that is like physical acclimatization. The folks that live in those places become somewhat used to it, but they make it and for generations, folks that have lived in really hot areas have incorporated building designs that create airflow and promote cooling passively. And so I think that in some ways, when we think about like the intersection between housing and the future of renewable energy and all those things, is that we can't ignore the fact that there have been generations of architects and folks building housing that didn't have that technology to begin with, but still maintained a healthy community even in the warm times of the past, which are different from the warm times of the present and future for sure. But so I would say like, on top of the distributed solar on rooftops kinds of stuff that you hear about, tax abatements, energy burden kinds of abatements and those sorts of things. I think we have to be putting our eyes on weatherization. Scott mentioned also painting rooftops white. That can dramatically influence the indoor temperatures. There are things that we already know work to reduce energy burden, to ameliorate it almost entirely through vernacular architecture. And then I think that's where we start getting to, maybe that'll lessen the lift in order to get the energy justice where we need it to. So again, it's like no silver bullet, silver buckshot kind of approach.
Thanks, Jeremy. Robert?
I was going to say tax abatement too, so I'll be really brief. There was a piece of legislature that was working its way through the Iowa state legislature where they were going to do tax abatements. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details, and I think it is fairly complicated what they were trying to do, but they were using the Hulk maps, and it's the first piece of legislation I've seen that used the Hulk maps as a way of shaping tax policy in an effort to, I think, spur investment in some of these areas. So you do have to worry about gentrification. You do kind of worry about the kind of eventual interest of the state in eventually getting more money on more taxable property. But I do think Jeremy's right that there's tax abatements opportunities to spur investment in cooling technologies. And I would say the same thing about gentrification, right? Like we do need to think about policy. There's a thread going on in the chat about gentrification. Like one thing that some cities have done is they've grandfathered in and locked in property assessments to keep people from being priced out of their neighborhoods because of rising property taxes. And so we just have to think really justice-oriented, anti-racist oriented in the policies we're making at the city, state, and federal level.
Thanks, Robert. Lisa, you've got the last word before we go to the audience.
Yeah, I can say whatever I know. I think just like we were talking earlier about heat solutions, that, it's a matter of kind of scale. I think there's a scale issue on energy, but I also think there's a customization. So, Baltimore, unfortunately, is not one of those cities that's growing. And so that means that we don't have as many, that solutions that work best for existing buildings aren't as impactful for us. And then on top of that, we have a lot of existing buildings that are in really bad shape. Again, the scars of redlining are like horribly visible in this city in terms of the condition of a lot of buildings. And so, you know, we can talk about weatherization, but, you know, interesting, I just had a conversation earlier this week with our weatherization person, and he was lamenting that, for example, weatherization doesn't fund ceiling fans. And so making that kind of change so that that is, you know, that's both a lower cost upfront, but a lower operational cost option to provide a little bit of cooling. You know, there also needs to be more funding available to sort of critical repairs. We have houses that often don't qualify for weatherization because there are too many major things wrong with it to, you know, there's a limit of how bad the structure can be to qualify for weatherization. And, you know, even things like, you know, ensuring that the wiring is sufficient. Sometimes there's not even sufficient wiring for a ceiling fan in terms of getting that in. And those sort of, I almost think about it as sort of wraparound services that you're trying to get, you know, some affordable cooling, and all of a sudden you're fixing, you know, knob and tube wiring, you know, or knob and tube, maybe I got that wrong. But, you know, I think this also ties to, you know, Jeremy, I'm glad you mentioned energy burden. I mean, that's a measure of success that we're looking to add to our CAP, because again, you know, there's scale, there's customization, but there's also making sure we have these co-benefits, and that, you know, making sure that, you know, energy bill assistance efforts can get tied into all of this, I think are really important. You know, and just a couple of other quick things. This is, you know, these are smaller things that hopefully aren't the last word, because I know we've got some great questions, but like one of the things Baltimore is trying to do as well is to bring solar, community solar into these, into buildings. Again, rooftop solar works great when you've got a good roof, when you're a homeowner, when you're not a renter that's maybe moving around a lot, whereas community solar that's focused on low and moderate income households can bring more of those benefits more broadly to lower income and maybe majority, you know, to advance sort of racial equity. You know, even something as simple as, you know, Tempe has an ordinance that says that renters are required by city ordinance to have working air conditioning. You know, that kind of sort of enforcement and regulation to sort of signal that this is important. You know, I think there's a lot still to be done around energy, and I'm glad you brought that in, this affordability and structural issue into the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you all panelists. We're now going to open it up for the audience Q&A, and we have a few there. Supraja, who's my wonderful assistant here in the room, has collected questions both from Huva and the chat in here. The first one up here is what's the intersection between urban heat islands and highway development, and maybe even highway development as it relates to redlining and HOLT codes? That's asked by Isabel Trevino.
I mean, I know Robert's done a lot of work on this too, but you know, our redlining paper goes into this a little bit, where, you know, post redlining, many of these communities then served the redlining maps were then the map that was used to derive where the highways were going to go. So here in Richmond, for example, the famous Maggie Walker, the first Black woman to own a bank in the entire country, lived in Jackson Ward, which was the Harlem of the South. And in the 1950s and 60s, that neighborhood was completely and totally severed and mostly demolished by the installation of a highway system that was meant to just funnel white people back into the suburbs. So not only were these environmental disparities and disamenities concentrated in these areas to begin with, much as like what Dr. Nelson said, but then we concentrated even more of them into these areas to make way for white flight. And at the same time, the formerly green-lined areas having immense wealth and privilege were able to politically keep those different uses out of their communities. So with it's just a continual cycle of focusing these land uses that were environmental disamenities into these formerly redlined areas. You can draw a straight line from Hulk mapping to the interstate system in almost every city that has one.
The only thing I'd add, that was perfect. The only thing I'd add is that we talk about redlined areas as areas that are disinvested in, and that's not exactly true. They're disinvested in terms of access to residential capital. There's a ton of investment that goes into there. It's not cheap to put in a highway. So we invest in these all the time, or have over the course of the 20th century. Urban renewal being another example that wreaked havoc and caused massive trauma for communities of color, destroying many of them. And that's a massive investment in those places. But so I just kind of come back to my point. Like, what we need to do is not think about places. We need to think about people in when we're making urban policies.
Absolutely. Scott or Lisa, I don't know if you had anything to add there, but there's a growing support for one question in particular here in the chat, as it relates to so the question reads, many cooling measures will involve improvements to private properties rather than on public right-of-way. How do we get apartment property managers, business owners, and small commercial strips in climate vulnerable neighborhoods interested, engaged, and then the tech financial support they need? How do we get that support for installing these cooling techniques? Particularly, Revan, the thing that popped out to my mind in that question was apartment property managers, because a lot of people of color, low wealth community members live in apartments. So who wants to tackle this one? How do we get the support in that direction? Maybe you, Lisa?
I mean, I can get started. I mean, it's a, one sort of stick. I mean, there's carrots and sticks. You think of them, local governments do have the stick of mandating some of these things. The issue with the most sort of common way of doing that is, it often is, it gets implemented scattershot, because you tend to do it at a time when somebody has to come in for a permit to do something. So you don't just get it. It doesn't just happen exactly where maybe you think it's needed most. So the combining those kinds of building code requirements with incentive programs and leading by example is a way to kind of pull people to these solutions. If we can't expect a business owner in a small commercial strip, for example, who isn't a student of heat, isn't a student of policy, unless we signal to those owners that the city thinks it's important because we put it in the city code. The city thinks it's important because we're doing it in our buildings, or we're doing it where we can. And oh, by the way, we're giving information on how to do these kinds of things. So I'm a fan of that combined approach, kind of pushing people and kind of pulling them at the same time. And there is a real role for governments in that to, a certain extent. I think the pull part can also be nonprofits, because to help, find that foundation, find that funding and share that out with, to help people find that funding for it, because this, landlord tenant problem is huge on all of these kinds of issues. And, we do have to find more solutions. So I'm hoping others on the panel have more that I can write down and use.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a lot to add, but I would say that as scientists, we often ignore this issue conveniently, and it's a very important one. And I mean, it seems to me that if it's properly incentivized, and if I'm thinking about cool roofs, for example, as Jeremy said, they're going to reduce energy expenditures. So for the person who owns the building is also the person paying the electric bill, the cooling bill. There's an incentive there as long as the actual implementation is appropriately incentivized. Speaking purely economically, that would be one piece I would add in.
Thanks for that, Scott. Others?
I think those were pretty comprehensive answers. I don't think anybody's doing it right yet. And I think yet is the operative word. We'll figure it out, but I think it has to come through, we're going through immense zoning code changes in cities all over the country, both addressing single family housing or single family zoning, as Robert mentioned, as well as like eliminating parking minimums. Those are the sorts of like scale of things that we need in order to address these. It's like in order to start seeing the overlap between these sectors, I think is really where we start to hit that. But you're seeing right now an immense sell-off of multifamily housing to equity investors from landlords because of the moratorium on evictions. So unless that's shining a light on a huge systemic issue that is even bigger than our climate woes, so I think that there's so many things that are that are shining this light on, like housing is this blinking red light right in front of us. And I don't think anybody really truly has their hands around it yet, but hopefully we figure out through local zoning, as well as incentivizing nonprofits, as well as, especially the nonprofits that seek to improve housing affordability and secure it, that those will be enough to start making these sorts of changes.
Thank you. Let's see, there's one final question. We've got 2 minutes on the clock. Very interested in artificial turf. So I've seen this pop up a couple times in the chat, and I was just about to get to it. So is there data, this most latest question here, is there data about whether heat illness is more common among athletes or artificial turf fields compared with artificial turf fields compared with grass? So that's kind of a specific question regarding athletes, but can we speak to kind of the contribution of these artificial areas, to the urban heat island effect?
I mean, I can say a couple of words. Essentially, artificial turf is going to get a lot hotter than most other surfaces, and it's going to reflect less sunlight at people. So in terms of the overall heat budget, it might come out about even, but in terms of actually making contact with it, it gets very hot. So there's been some research looking at, I think Jeremy put it in the chat there, looking at children's playgrounds and the dangers there. So I think, used with caution. I've seen it, promoted as a way to save water, but it's complex, and I wouldn't necessarily, I'd be careful about where it's implemented and how it's implemented.
Yeah, and just to add to that, as far as like the illness and morbidity information, some of the only heat-related illnesses that occur in September in Virginia are in teenagers, and it's presumably people that are practicing in outdoor fields. Now, that the physical exertion is much more dependent on the thermal quality of the whole environment and not so much the surface. So it's much more seems to be a symptom of either the heat index or the wet bulb globe temperature. So it's probably an additive effect, but is it as large as the total heat thermal burden that individual is feeling, especially on like a hot, humid, stuffy, no wind, high sun kind of day?
Thanks for that, Scott and Jeremy. I also wanted to flag, folks might want to, and I hope it wasn't scheduled at this time, but if it was, you can watch the recording. We also have a session this week on equitable housing and having that conversation about, I'm sure they'll get into green infrastructure or retrofits and fixes there in the equitable housing session in the DMV. So with that plug, I will adjourn this panel. Thank you very much to our panelists. I have to give my applause like this because I accidentally closed the YouTube tab that I used earlier. So, and attendees, feel free to engage with the panelists via Whova. You can send them messages, assuming you all have registered or are on Whova, but you can send them messages and engage that way. This room will be turning over at 2:20 to special invited talks. This is a group of 3 presentations from former students in the program and others giving presentations on some of their work. It's not going to be a panel discussion. The discussion is going to be more of a kind of slides presentation. And Jeremy's put his Twitter tag, his Twitter handle in the chat. So feel free to continue the conversation with these great panelists. Panelists, thank you again for joining us. And take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.